let's ask ourselves, why is it that Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor at the ICC, has indicted two leading Israeli figures, Netanyahu and Gallant, for war crimes and crimes against humanity, indeed the crime against humanity of extermination for the starvation policy, but not genocide?
This was Dirk Moses, Professor of International Relations, genocide researcher and published author. What we're discussing today goes to the very core of what we are seeing in Palestine or other hot conflict zones like Ukraine today. Imagine for a moment it's 1948. The world is still reeling from the Holocaust and the United Nations is trying to craft a law that will ensure never again really means never again. The result? The Genocide Convention, hailed as a monumental achievement in international law. But there's a dirty little secret. This landmark law, the very one that was supposed to protect against the worst of human atrocities, was crafted by states more interested in protecting their own dirty laundry than bringing justice to the victims. So let's not sugarcoat this. The big players at the table, the United States, the Soviet Union and the old colonial powers like the UK and France, weren't just thinking about stopping genocide. No. They were thinking about stopping anyone from calling their own actions genocide. The US, with its bloody history of slavery, segregation and the near extermination of Native Americans, was in no rush at all to have its own crimes scrutinized. And let's not forget the Soviet Union, which was already knee-deep in purges and brutal crackdowns on any ethnic group or political dissident who dared to defy Stalin's regime. As for the colonial powers, they were still busy violently suppressing independence movements across Africa and Asia. These powers played a clever game. They ensured that the definition of genocide was narrow enough to focus only on the physical acts like killing or causing serious harm. They deliberately excluded broader forms of destruction like cultural genocide or economic deprivation because they knew their own policies, from Jim Crow in the American South to colonial repression in Algeria, could be implicated. And when the US saw that this convention could backfire, they simply refused to ratify it for nearly 40 years, only doing so under immense international pressure in 1988. But even then, the US wasn't really on board. They made it clear that if any American soldier was ever brought before the International Criminal Court in Den Haag, they would take whatever steps necessary, including military actions, to free them. You heard that right, the US threatened to invade the Netherlands, a NATO ally, to prevent their own war criminals from facing justice. And while the US was busy playing the moral leader, it was simultaneously supporting brutal dictatorships across South America, from Pinochet in Chile to the military junta in Argentina, regimes that committed atrocities that could easily qualify as genocide under any reasonable interpretation of the law. Yet the US shielded them, all in the name of fighting communism, showing once again that its commitment to human rights was nothing more than a facade. And then of course there's Israel. A nation born from the ashes of the Holocaust, you might think it would be a staunch defender of the Genocide Convention. But Israel's actions towards the Palestinians tell a very different story. For decades, Israel has imposed a brutal occupation on the West Bank and turned Gaza into what US Ambassador Charles Friedman described as the world's largest open-air prison. The systematic dispossession, military assaults, F-16s in the sky dropping bombs, and the blockade that has left millions of Palestinians in very dire conditions, these are all actions that echo the very atrocities the Genocide Convention was supposed to prevent. Yet Israel has managed to avoid any accountability, largely thanks to unwavering US support in the international arena. So let's not sugarcoat this. The Genocide Convention, while a critical piece of international law, was born out of a mix of genuine horror and cold, calculated self-interest. The very states that championed this law were also the ones who carefully crafted it to avoid any risk of being held accountable for their own crimes. This is a stark reminder that even the most noble sounding international agreements are often forged in the fires of realpolitik, where power and self-preservation rule the day. So Dirk Moses will give you now the tools you need to understand the underlying mechanisms which often prevent the prosecution of war crimes and genocide, even if they are committed in broad daylight, as we see them unfolding in Gaza right now. But first, an urgent message. Have you noticed how the voices speaking truth to power are getting harder to find? That's no accident. This channel is one of the few that dares to bring you unfiltered, hard-hitting political interviews, and because of this, we have been shadow banned. How do we know? Well, because of YouTube's own creator statistics and thanks to a growing number of viewer comments like these. But there is something you could do. Get involved with just 2 or 3 clicks. When you subscribe, like and hit the bell button, you're not just clicking some buttons. You're making a stand for free speech and independent thought. Your actions are crucial in helping us breaking through the barriers of the mighty YouTube algorithm and to reach more critical minds like yours. And if you haven't yet explored our previous interviews, you're missing out on some of the most revealing and insightful conversations available. Our archives include whistleblowers like John Kiriakou, who risk it all to expose systematic torture in CIA prison camps, diplomatic mavericks like the US ambassadors Charles Freeman and Jack Matlock, or the Dutch ambassador Nicolaus van Dam, and activists like the so-called Hamas lawyer Stanley Cohen or Ken O'Keefe, the former US Marine who, with his bare hands, disarmed 2 Israeli commandos whilst they shot and killed 10 people on the Gaza Freedom Flotilla in 2010. But now enough of this, let's sit back and enjoy another powerful interview that challenges the status quo. And here we go, Dirk Moses. Thank you so much for joining. How is it today in New York?
It's extremely hot, but very good to be with you.
Same here. We have it really hot. I wear linen, and still it's too hot. Yeah. This interview is a while in the making. You are very active. I mean, I have a whole list of books and articles in front of me. I mean, this is like 2 pages long. You just have arrived from a trip in a couple of days. Actually, tomorrow you will go to Peru. If you encapsulate yourself, yeah, for people who don't know you, I mean, I know we just saw the introduction, yeah, but from your perspective, if you encapsulate yourself in a nutshell, how would you introduce Dirk Moses?
Right. So I'm a professor of international relations at the City College of New York, which is one of the colleges of the City University of New York, which is a public system and serves the sort of new migrants, if you like, of the city, of which there are many. Historically, it was a very Jewish university, as Jews from Russia came 100 years ago or so, 120 years ago. And now the demography's changed somewhat. But it's always been, as a result, a very progressive left-wing kind of place. But it's produced many important intellectuals, including many neoconservatives over the years, especially at City College, who were leftists when they were younger and then went the other way later. I have been working on the genocide issue on and off for about 25 years. I started my academic life at least as a lecturer in the University of Sydney. I worked at the European University Institute in Florence for 5 years, also taught at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. But I studied for quite a while in Germany and did my PhD, although enrolled at the University of California in Berkeley, to a large extent at the University of Freiburg in the late 90s, where I did the research and lived, and became very integrated in the German academic system, which I know quite well. And I spend quite a bit of time in Germany, each summer and so forth, and write about it a bit. So, right now I'm sort of mopping up the consequences of the book I did a few years ago on the concept of genocide, and now applying the lessons, as it were, to different theatres in the Middle East and in Europe. But I'm also writing about the debate in Germany about these issues and the repression of free speech in Germany.
Speaking of which, how is it going with free speech in Germany?
It's not going so well. I mean, there are versions of this problem in the US as well, where academics are being persecuted by the university administrators for their stances on the Israel-Palestine question. I mean, in Germany, where everything's run by the state, the possibilities for disciplining are far greater. But also in the art sector, which is also reliant on government funding. I mean, Berlin, which was such a fascinating ferment for artists in particular, and also from the Middle East, who fled there during the Arab Spring to engage in their work, are all leaving now because of the crackdown on anyone who hails from that country and may not follow the Staatsräson on the Israel-Palestine question. So there's a real chill throughout the academic and artistic worlds.
Yeah, and I think it's really widely spread from the US, in Europe, here in the Netherlands where I'm living. Yeah. Israel anyway, I don't know if you know her. I interviewed Professor Nurit Peled El-Hanan, who is the sister of Miko Peled. Yeah, I interviewed him too. And she lost her job because of speaking out. Yeah, she did research in regards to racism in Israeli school books.
Yeah.
Very outspoken lady, but you no longer can, even on academic level, you no longer can speak freely.
So, I mean, when people talk about shared values, I guess that does seem right, because there's a shared value in persecuting or prosecuting academic freedom. It's happening in Israel and in Western countries. So this is a very worrying development. I mean, maybe you'll get the opportunity to interview Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, who was arrested by the Israeli authorities for her work, and was condemned by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where she works. She was jailed for a while. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah, it's a good point. I will try to reach out. Yeah. Now, you sent me a couple of articles. I did my own research, but there's one, erasing the distinction between genocidal and military conduct. Yeah? And I want to say, we come back later to your book, The Problems of Genocide. Yeah? But there are a couple of things that I wanted to fish out. Yeah? Maybe let's start with the ICG case led by South Africa. What's your...
What do you want me to say about it?
It's a good one.
Yeah.
Military actions were considered separate from genocide in the past, but the current global security of Israel's action in Gaza suggests that this distinction, is more or less out of the window.
Yeah.
And I think if I interpret correctly what you wrote, you said that will create a new international norm, and we can talk about this in a moment. Yeah. But I think you're right. But there's an addition to that. It will, or it already has created a precedence case for future wars. That's my fear. Yeah, but that's not what you mean. So please tell us, new international norm.
So perhaps the readers need to understand a bit what I mean by this stark binary between genocidal and military logics, which underpins the law of genocide. So as the convention was being debated in 1947 and 1948, the drafters of because there were two drafts before they got to the final version, and it percolated through various UN committees, and there's a 2,000 pages of commentary and documentation on these debates, which you can read, and then you can see what people were saying about what should genocide be and what it should not be. Right? And it dawned on state representatives, because we're dealing with representatives of states here, not with NGOs, not with victim groups and so forth. And it dawned on them that the Allies had killed quite a few civilians on Axis side, Japanese and Germans, in the course of the war, and that we don't want this to be captured by any new law on genocide. So they distinguished very clearly between genocidal logics, which is the aim to destroy a group, ethnic, racial, or religious, or national group as such, in whole or in part, on the one hand, and a military logic of defeat. Where you want to defeat an enemy, but you don't want to destroy the enemy as such. Even though in the course of a military campaign, you kill a lot of their civilians, like it's an aerial bombing, like dropping atomic bombs onto Japanese cities, okay, which would clearly be illegal since the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols to them in 1977, but not in 1945. German military personnel were not prosecuted for the aerial warfare that Germany waged at Nuremberg, for the reason that you didn't want to establish a precedent that the Allies could be prosecuted, right? So the Nuremberg trials, a great step forward in international law as they were also highly limited in many ways. And so was the Genocide Convention, because it didn't seek to criminalize a lot of quite criminal conduct by states during the Second World War, including by Allied states. Now, why did they do that? Well, it's not just because of what had happened in the Second World War. The Cold War was developing by the late 1940s, and states didn't want to hamstring themselves, this is both sides of the Cold War, by an international convention that would limit the way they conduct their war, dirty warfare against civilians, right, for example. Look what the Americans did in North Korea in the early 50s, which they carpet bombed and killed 2 million North Koreans and destroyed about 80% of urban infrastructure, and with just carpet bombing. This is before precision missiles, obviously. These are killing civilians mainly, right? Now, the last thing they wanted was a genocide convention that would prevent them doing that. Okay. Likewise, the war in Vietnam, which killed millions of Indo-Chinese, or the Russian conduct in various wars, whether in Chechnya supporting the Syrians in putting down the uprising there, where millions of civilians are killed cumulatively. Okay, so it's not a matter of just picking on the West or the Americans. This is something that all states have an interest in. They also, by the late 40s, were those states that had empires like the French and the British, didn't want a convention that would prevent them putting down colonial rebellions. Nor did they want a convention which included cultural genocide that would prevent them assimilating minorities. And that would pertain, for example, to many South American states, Brazil, Argentina, and so forth. The last thing they wanted was a convention that allowed indigenous peoples within their states, so Indians, as it were, to be able to appeal to an international convention to prevent their forced assimilation. Forced assimilation also in states like Canada and Australia until the 70s was considered a progressive policy, not letting them speak their native languages, forcing them to speak the colonized language, putting them in boarding schools, all that kind of thing, right? This is now called cultural genocide, but there's no legal concept of cultural genocide. It was taken out of the convention during those drafting stages, right? So, in any event, to get back to the distinction between legal logics and military logics, and genocidal logics, this stark binary was set up at the time between an intention to destroy and an intention to defeat. Now, this makes sense in a sense conceptually, right? You can sort of see how, in the case of the military logic, the killing ends when there's defeat. Whereas in a genocide, for example, the Nazis, which is what people were thinking of course, after the Second World War, the Nazis would have continued pursuing Jews at the end, despite hostilities. They would have kept going, Now, however, empirically, if we look at the conflicts since the Second World War, and in Gaza, genocidal logics are fused with military ones. They're never empirically so conceptually separate as they are in the legal binary. So that means that it's virtually impossible for international courts to successfully, or say for the prosecution case, to successfully argue that a genocide is taking place, because the defense will argue that no, there's a military conflict taking place, there's a war taking place, and we're targeting insurgents or whoever, terrorists, what have you, separatists, and we're not targeting the civilian population as such. We're not here to destroy anyone. We're here to defeat an insurgency, and that argument often wins. And where a genocide case can be made, for example, just in Srebrenica, in one case in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda, you had to shoehorn the circumstances to make it, in a sense, resemble the Holocaust. And that's, given the discourse about the uniqueness of the Holocaust, it's an extremely difficult analogy to make. Now, given the hundreds of millions of people who've died in armed conflict and in, say, the Great Leap Forward famine in China in the late 50s and early 60s, which is the largest mass casualty event in the 20th century, how many of these are covered by the genocide? I'll finish with this. The genocide concept hardly covers any of these, and none of them have been prosecuted. So, I've got my doubts about the efficacy of the concept of genocide as it's formulated in law.
I just wanted to add, also India, when the British starved the Indian population to death by I don't know how many hundreds of thousands, right? But on that context, I looked on the same context, I looked in a different article of yours. It's called "Why the International Community Made It So Difficult to Prosecute the Crime of Genocide." And there were two statements that really stuck out for me because they are, how shall I say it, pretty outspoken, and they're your quotes, So international law on genocide is working as designed, right? Allowing states to ruthlessly exterminate security threats while making it difficult to apply that law, number one. Number two, the grotesque nature of the law of genocide is that victim numbers are irrelevant. All that counts are intent. I don't think you made yourself many friends with those statements.
No, well, I didn't get into this business to make friends. We're here to tell the truth, and as we see it. And, I felt that there's been a fair bit of sentimental, wishful thinking in the genocide studies community, where rather than clear, sober, and unsentimental thinking, we need to confront the fact that why is it so difficult to prove the concept of genocide? And once you go back and look at how it was formulated in law in the late 40s, these debates I mentioned in the United Nations, where state parties say openly, well, we can't have a genocide convention that prevents us from putting down a communist rebellion, in some Latin American countries. Or the Russians flipping it around, but making the same argument, saying, we don't want a convention that prevents us from cracking down on anti-communist threats, within the Soviet Union. After all, the Soviets had committed all kinds of crimes within their borders, whether against the Ukrainians, against the Kazakhs in the famines of the early 30s, the deportation of so-called punished nations like the Chechens and Ingush in the early 40s, and many others. Right, the last thing they wanted was for their crimes to be prosecutable by an international convention. Let's not forget the Nuremberg trial was also an ad hoc court, like the ad hoc international criminal tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Ad hoc means they were one-off courts. The innovation we have since then is now we have a standing international court called the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, right? But it doesn't allow the prosecution of states. That's only what the ICJ can. That's what the ICJ does, right? The ICC prosecutes individuals. And to circle back to your point, let's ask ourselves, why is it that Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor at the ICC, has indicted two leading Israeli figures, Netanyahu and Gallant, for war crimes and crimes against humanity? Indeed, the crime against humanity of extermination for the starvation policy, but not genocide. Likewise, they've indicted Putin and the senior official who runs the program for kidnapping and adopting out Ukrainian children, also for war crimes, but not for genocide. Although the removing of children from one group and taking them to another is actually covered by the Genocide Convention. I mean, in both cases, the court has decided not to run the genocide line, but the easier to prove war crimes and crimes against humanity line. Despite the fact that there's all this genocidal rhetoric washing around, swirling around in the Israeli public sphere, in which the South African team catalogued meticulously in its submissions to the ICJ. Well, we would need to ask Karim Khan and his team why they've done that. But my observation is that they've done so because they observed that an armed conflict is taking place in both theatres. Although I know we're going to focus on the Gaza case today. There is an armed conflict going on. Hamas is still in the field, sending rockets occasionally, jumping out from hideouts and planting bombs on tanks, occasionally firing, rocket missiles or what have you at Israeli armed personnel. So, and their resistance, as it were, is being celebrated by many people, right? I'm not going to get into the merits of this here, but there is an armed conflict going on, even if it's highly asymmetrical. I mean, you have this, obviously one-sided. Just have to look at the casualty figures, right? But that's certainly how it's being regarded legally by the International Criminal Court and probably by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which administers the Geneva Conventions. And that means the rules of the Geneva Conventions apply about who is recognized as a POW, who is a legitimate combatant, and then the rules about how you handle them when you capture them and so forth, which we don't need to get into now. But once it's classified as an armed conflict, it's very difficult to then combine it with the genocide accusation because they're conceptually and legally distinguished. Although empirically, genocides occur in the context of armed conflict, and that's why it's so confusing and messy. I can get, if you like, further into our conversation about how I see the logics of war and genocide being fused in this case. The Israeli mode of warfare is something new, and I think that's why the ICJ is going to have an opportunity to rule, if it decides to do so, to update international norms and law regarding new forms of warfare where AI technology is involved. That's not something the Russians are doing. It's you need a high level of technological proficiency to run this type of particular warfare.
There's a lot to unpack what you just said. So
Sure.
AI, for example. Yeah. So in the first, 2 or 3 days, Israel attacked about 3,600 targets, which they only were able to do based on AI. Yeah? And then when you dig a bit further in and you see how they determined their targets, it could be a telephone call to someone around the world. You spoke by telephone, you're sitting there in Gaza, you spoke to someone, maybe 3 months ago you spoke to somebody, I don't know, in Yemen or in the US for that matter. Yeah. And based on that phone call, your potential target, AI then targets you. And here is the mind-blowing number, if you associate with that. Yeah, I recently interviewed somebody else that he told me that the collateral damage, the acceptable collateral damage, is increasing. At the beginning was about 100 people as collateral damage, and it's now up to 300 to 400. And as we have seen by the last rescue of those 2 or 3 hostages, yeah, for which almost 400 Palestinians were killed as collateral damage, yeah, that seems to be true. So AI is playing, Amnesty International published a report called Automated Apartheid. AI, facial recognition, automatic shooting, all these kind of things, yeah. So that's definitely something new. But coming back to genocide, coming back to war crimes, I don't know where to make the demarcation line between war crimes and genocide, yeah. But
well, we can talk about that if you like.
Yeah.
And also the AI issue. I mean, the key articles were the 2 in the 972 mag, which I think the Amnesty report might be relying on. I mean, they're based on off-the-record interviews with former drone operators and people who worked in this AI unit. The journalist was able to deduce that the targeting mechanism was, as you say, the use of the tracking of low-level Hamas operatives' phone usage, right? They cross-reference and so forth. It may well have been, they may have been police officers and so forth. But, Hamas runs all kinds of agencies. It's not just the military wing. So they were killing pretty indiscriminately, yet targeted. Okay. So, and this is important in relation to the question of genocide and war crimes. Israel was not engaged in carpet bombing, just like the Americans in Korea in the 1950s, which is just, dropping ordnance on a city and everything gets destroyed. I mean, they were waiting, we know from these articles, from the Lavender AI technology plus the Who's Daddy software, which they used together. They figured out who was a Hamas operative, for want of a better word, but they waited till, it's always a he, they waited till he got home, we know from these articles, and then they, which was an apartment block, and then they lobbed a high proportion or a highly explosive munition and destroyed the entire building with the women and children in it. Now, that's how you account for the high level of proportion of women and children among the casualty figures, right? Now, this is where we get to this fusion of military and genocidal logics in practice, not in theory, but in practice. Yes, it was targeted at a figure who the Israelis could argue, if accused of war crimes, is a military target. Right? This person represents a military threat, however indirectly. Right? They could argue if hauled before a court, and then they could run the argument about collateral damage. But usually that argument succeeds because you don't really know how many civilians are in the vicinity, and this is regrettable. But here they're waiting till the operative gets home. So they know they're going to be killing the women and children and anyone else, the grandparents, what have you, in a very calculated manner. It's not collateral damage anymore. It's willfully engaged killing of civilians. Okay, and I don't know if the law has really caught up with this. Now, it may be a war crime individually. The thing about prosecuting these issues as war crimes is that each bomb or bombing is a separate incident. You don't take them collectively, right? Now, given the tens of thousands of bombings, missile strikes that have taken place, you can see this is empirically impossible, leaving aside the fact that Israel is not allowing any prosecutors to get inside Gaza to look at the quote-unquote the crime scene. They can do that in Ukraine because the Bucha is in Ukrainian hands. Right? You do need a forensic investigation, and you can't expect the Israelis to hand over the records of their missile operators. They're just not going to do it, right? I mean, that's why the ICJ and the ICC are focusing on the starvation policy, because you can deduce that from being outside Gaza. You can look at the statements of Israeli leaders, and you can look at what's happening at the checkpoints, because there are UN personnel there, like how many trucks are getting through and so forth. So it's much easier to prove. You don't need to be in Gaza. But getting back to the bombing, individually, these might be or may not be war crimes, right? These waiting for the Hamas operative to get back home to drop the building and kill all the family members and any other families that are in this apartment block, right? But if you take it cumulatively, seriatim one by one, and then cumulatively, the effect is genocidal. And it's not incidental, it's not collateral, it's quite willed. But it is in the context of a military targeting, so these logics are fused. So the Israeli lawyers may say, here we have an intention to defeat Hamas. We're not trying to destroy Palestinian civilians as such. But, the counter-argument would be, well, this is not incidental damage according to war crimes. I mean, this is a conscious decision to kill tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians in the course of your military actions. So doesn't this push this in the genocide direction? Somewhere on the spectrum, if you like. Now that is the dilemma or the conundrum or the messiness that the ICJ is going to have to contend with when they get to the merits case, the merits stage of the ICJ case.
You just mentioned intent, yeah? I mean, thanks to social media, we have evidence from Israeli leaders, from Netanyahu down the whole chain to the soldiers on the field, genocidal intent, right? Which is actually one of the topics that I noted from your book, The Problem of Genocide, because you discussed the language of transgression, but we come back to this later, yeah? But again, thanks to social media, we know what they really want. So they can say, well, actually, our only intent was to drive out or exterminate Hamas, yeah? But we know from their own words and repeatedly over, over the whole period, yeah? Is that evidence? Would there be evidence?
I mean, I'm not an international lawyer, I hasten to add, right? So certainly South Africa is making that case, and they've also followed up with a dossier, I think in late May, with even more quotations since their initial application in late December last year. Because as you say, the Israeli society keeps giving with genocidal statements, that there are no innocent children, no one is innocent in Gaza, Gaza should be wiped out, and so forth, right? But in response, the Israeli legal team and the commentators you see online who are supporting the Israeli case, they say, well, there's a lot of hot air out there. I mean, no one's denying that these statements take place or have been uttered, but they say these aren't guiding military action. What you've got with those drone operators and the missile operators is a chain of command that is governed by or regulated by Israeli military lawyers, and that they're sticking to the rules of armed conflict. And it's irrelevant what politicians say on TV. They kind of keep it separate from the actual military processes. So it remains to be seen how the judges at the ICJ would treat this. But once again, it's interesting to see that neither the ICC and neither Russia or Ukraine or Gaza cases have decided to go down the genocide route. I mean, after all, there are plenty of genocidal statements by Russian leaders and media personalities as well, which have been catalogued. I published an article about them in the Journal of Genocide Research last year, which is coming out as a book now, on the question of genocide in that case. But I know we're not going to talk about that in detail. But the hesitancy of international courts to embrace the option of genocide when there are the easier to prove options of war crimes and crimes against humanity is very interesting to observe, and once again makes you wonder why, what's the point of the genocide concept? I mean, there is an argument among international lawyers that the concept of genocide, the law of genocide, has an expressivist or an expressive function. That is, the very fact that it's impossible to prove sets a norm. The norm that you can't destroy an ethnic, racial, or religious group as such, a norm against genocide. So the logic being, well, then the states won't do that. But in fact, we see in practice that military and genocidal logics are fused or interlocking, and I don't think that theory of expressionism is very helpful there. I think we need to come to terms with the fact that this binary distinction between military logics of defeat, genocidal logics of destruction are actually fused. When you look at the fate of civilian populations and also their environments. So it's argued that the Israelis are not doing what the Americans and British did in Dresden, which is just carpet bomb the city entirely. It's not targeted in that sense. They just flatten the city. Although they may have argued that there are factories or something, they just flatten the city. They are pinpointing where Hamas operatives are and knocking down those buildings one by one. But if you look at drone footage of Gaza, it does look like Dresden. It's completely flattened. So the outcome is genocidal, if you like. I'm not suggesting Dresden is genocide. I want to make that clear, right? That was just an analogy people are using in the debate. But the destruction is total. Now, if you also add the destruction of schools, hospitals, infrastructure and universities, as well as the systematic destruction of agricultural land, and then the creation of a buffer zone, and also military safe zones in northern Gaza, you have sort of taken together a complete destruction of Palestinian life. So it's not just the death toll; it's these other issues, other contexts which enable life to be reproduced. Then you are looking at the destruction of Palestinian society, life and limb. And this is what Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer who invented the concept of genocide, and a very broad definition in 1944, was getting at. He said there are a number of techniques of genocide, most of which didn't make it into the Genocide Convention, mind you. But his pure, if you like, distillation of genocide, which was a synonym for him for the destruction of nations, right? It's the language people have used for a long time. He then distills that into one word. And as he explains it, when he's using the Nazi occupation of his native Poland, Czechoslovakia, and so forth as an example, they did more than just round up people and kill them, although they did that too. They exploited the local resources. They banned local languages. They decapitated the political leadership of these occupied societies so that they were leaderless. They tried to demoralize them. He talked about spiritual and moral values. There was a moral technique or policy of genocide. Banal things like introducing pornography and excessive alcoholism, as a way to degrade a population. So they're no longer thinking in elevated national terms. Right? So genocide had this very broad, many-pronged, multifaceted character. Now that was reduced in the Genocide Convention to its biological element, killing masses of people or putting them in conditions like in camps which were calculated to destroy them.
Much of what we see, it's very tempting to make now the focus on the proximate question as opposed to the ultimate question, the what, as opposed to why. Yeah, so many people focus now on everything that happened after September the 7th, right? But if we expand our view or our investigation into genocide or not, into, let's say, the last 75 years, yeah, many of the things that you just brought up, we have seen, right, consistently. Also, the intent and the motivation behind it is very similar. Yeah? I know I get in very hot water.
You will.
Yeah.
You will in Germany. So it's interesting you raise that. It's important you raise that because the South African case, as well as Francesca Albanese's representations as a special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories at the United Nations, have insisted that the genocidal moment we're dealing with now, as they put it, is embedded in the history of what they call Zionist settler colonial expansion, which began, of course, around over 100 years ago, culminated in 1947 and 48 in the expulsion of Palestinians from their historic homeland, known as the Nakba, and then had different phases and modalities since then. You had more expulsions in 1967 during the Six-Day War, after the Six-Day War. You had during the military government in the north of Israel until 1966, large-scale land expropriations, of people who are Israeli citizens, Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. You have the systematic discrimination in the occupied West Bank. You have now, of course, masses of settler attacks on Palestinian villages and shepherds and so forth in order to
They
drive.
look really like pogroms, like in the Second World War. I mean, the image, you can take them next to each other. It's exactly the same.
Yeah, without getting into historical analogies, it's interesting, I think, that before the 7th of October, some Israeli authorities were using that language. After there were fire bombings of Palestinian homes by settlers, various sensible Israeli military leaders said this looks like a pogrom. We've got to stop this. Now, that kind of self-critical language has stopped since the 7th of October, and people who utter it are, lose their jobs or beaten up by the cops. I mean, I don't know if you're following the footage of the protest movement, the impressive protest movement in Israel, to press the government to negotiate to release hostages and so forth, is met with considerable police violence. And these are Jewish Israelis that are being subject to it. It's difficult to imagine what Palestinians have to endure, if they were to show their face on the street. So it would be even worse. And they're more or less defenseless now in the West Bank because the army, whereas in the past didn't do much to help Palestinians, but there was some restraint regarding the settlers. Now they're unleashed. And
Ben Gvir has armed the settler with tens of thousands of automatic rifles, and you can see them on social media. The settlers are plundering and burning everything, and the army just watches on.
So what the South African legal team and Francesca Albanese's various reports argue was that there's a continuum here, as you were suggesting before, from over 100 years. It's worth mentioning now that Rashid Khalidi's important book on the 100 Years' War on Palestine, and I think Settler Colonialism is in the subtitle, has just been translated into German by a Swiss publisher, mind you, not a German one, but it's in German, and they changed the title. I mean, I mentioned this book because it describes this process, not as a lawyer, but as an historian, right? And in the German translation, they changed the war against Palestine to the war about Palestine. So it might be interesting to chase why that happened. Yeah.
Language is very important, which brings me briefly back to Netanyahu and genocidal language, but only briefly. Yeah? So Netanyahu referenced the story of Amalek, right? And you said before, well, there are the politicians and there's the army. Now, I don't make this distinction. For me, I think Noam Chomsky said it to me, Israel is not a state with an army, but an army with a state. When he said it, it took me months to really understand. Actually, it took me till I had the interview with Chaim Brashid, Israeli scholar, where we focused on the topic, which made me understand there is no separation between Israeli society, well, within limitations, I have to be more specific, but between the army and the politicians at least. And now they have a right-wing government, and the right-wing government, they don't care about the internal dissent. They're exactly the same way to the internal dissent to stay in power, like they're towards the Palestinians, or external dissent, right?
You want me to comment on that?
Sorry?
You want me to comment on the Amalek issue? Well, I mean, I've spent a bit of time in Israel, and it is a highly militarized place. And you see commentators saying, the IDF is Israeli society, and Israeli society is the IDF, and so forth, which is a legally tricky thing to say. They said that before the 7th of October, I think, because now everybody's saying, well, you can't kill Israeli civilians, that's against international law, which I agree with, mind you. Hamas didn't stick to international law on the 7th of October. Things got out of control.
Can I say one thing? I say one thing? And hold the thought, That's an argument that many people say, but this march of return, where the Palestinians peacefully tried to
2017,
peacefully,
I think.
Yes. And they were just shot en masse.
By
and
snipers.
Now the argument is, I mean, we tried, nothing's happening, so what else do we have, right?
So this is an argument about, armed conflict versus armed resistance versus other kinds of resistance. We can get to that. But you asked me about the Amalek analogy. Many people commented on that when Netanyahu uttered uttered this phrase. He's been using this phrase for a long time, mind you, because of his obsession with Iran, and the Amalek case goes back to antiquity, and Iran is the protagonist there, or an Iranian or Persian, a Persian king. So this is given the Israeli perception that Iran is behind Hamas and also Hezbollah. This is a powerful metaphor about ancestral enemies and hereditary enemies for him to make within Israeli society. And of course, it does collectively criminalize Palestinians, as many people pointed out, and has been seized by many people to point out the genocidal implications of statements by Israeli leaders. So, of course, it's been in his defense, it's been said that no, he's referring to Hamas, not to all Palestinians. This once again is going to have to be thrashed out by the court. People have walked back a lot of these statements. I mean, it's interesting to see. But I try to follow this as much as I can. I don't read Hebrew, but you can read the Jerusalem Post, the Times of Israel, and many other people online, and you can see what if you follow this every day, you can see the patterns of discourse. And as soon as somewhat late, maybe in November, so a month after the 7th of October, as soon as people realized in Israel and their supporters elsewhere that people were noting this and cataloging it, and that it would be used against Israel in possible legal proceedings, Netanyahu and others dialed it back, and he started going on American TV, which I also watch, saying, "We abide by international law. We're sticking scrupulously to the rules of international armed conflict," and so forth. So, and this is what the Israeli legal team at the ICJ is also saying. So once again, it'll depend what the judges accept as authentic evidence of intent.
Because people said that Amalek, Netanyahu, directed this comment against Hamas. Amalek says, kill the women, the children, the dogs, the donkeys, everything. Yeah. So, I mean, it's very specific.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how the courts decide this. I resist as a scholar and not as an international lawyer getting into the business of adjudicating what is and what is not genocide. I know interviewers love to try to pin academics down, and there are academics who will say, they'll play the guru or the expert, if you like, or even, in a way, God. This is genocide, this is not genocide. I don't like getting into that business because I have my doubts about the efficacy of the law and even about the efficacy of the concept. So we can get into why and how that's the case, if you like. But you also raised the issue of Amalek, and then the right of the March of Return. Do you want to talk about that?
We can.
So, as I wrote in an article in the Boston Review in November last year, the Palestinians, like all indigenous people, are placed in an impossible position by colonial imperial occupations, because if they resist in a military way, and it's often terroristic in various cases, like we saw on the 7th of October, it's not. If you like, the cause may be noble, but the vehicle, the means is very violent and indiscriminate against the civilians of the occupiers. And illegal according to international law today. But that kind of resistance is always smashed and very rarely succeeds in expelling an occupier. And if you like, the quote-unquote barbaric violence will inflict some damage on often the European occupier. But the civilized violence, which is technologically more advanced in this case, the European or the Israeli here, is far more efficient and kills far more people. So you can just look at the ratio now between the 7th of October and Palestinians in Gaza today is like it's 1 to 40. Maybe it's more, right? So it could be much more, leaving aside the tens of thousands of children who've lost limbs and will be maimed and mutilated for life. So that's an historical pattern we see for hundreds of years if you study these things, right? Now the dilemma in here is that that peaceful resistance is often futile as well. I mean, as you said, when there was a march of return which entailed just unarmed Palestinians in Gaza walking towards the border zone, I mean, where the fence is, and then being picked off by snipers, and I think 300 were killed, and many more were wounded. Because there were, I think, the use of dum-dum bullets. People's legs were blown off. Knees were targeted, and so forth. I mean, and the world community, the international community, looked aside, and it was quickly forgotten. Now, of course, it's not forgotten within Palestinian circles, right? And people like Hamas then reason, also with the normalization process with the Sunni states, diplomatically, especially Saudi Arabia, which has always insisted that there can be no normalization until there's a two-state solution. I mean, once the Palestinian, the Hamas leadership saw that they were going to be thrown under the bus by their erstwhile supporters, they decided to take these dramatic steps. So this is the dilemma that indigenous people are faced with. They kind of lose either way, and we live in a world today which is an outcome of those processes. I grew up in Australia, where indigenous people were the majority of the population in the middle of the 19th century, and by the end of the 19th century, so within 50 years, they were a small minority because they'd been decimated through disease, massacres, dislocation, which had disrupted, the reproduction of family life and so forth. And their land had been taken. And this process was going on globally. It was also going on in Russia and China in their peripheries, mind you. It was not just the Anglo-Saxon and Iberian powers, then Latin America and Canada, Australia, and so forth. It was a global process where nomadic peoples, if you like, were shunted aside by expanding settler states, which engaged in settled agriculture.
And a number of my guests mentioned exactly what you said. They're afraid that the Palestinian people in Palestine, West Bank, Gaza, might have the same fate as the Aborigines in Australia or the native people in the US.
Yeah, Yasser Arafat often mentioned, we are not Red Indians. We're not going to meet their fate. And so that analogy was a lie for him. Benny Morris, the Israeli historian, who I've met on occasion at conferences and so forth, yeah. He also used that analogy, but the other way around. He said, you wouldn't have North America had there not been this crushing of the Native Americans, and we have the same right as the Americans do. You don't get a successful modern society unless you pay this price. But he wants the Palestinians to pay this price. Now, when I put it to him once at a seminar at NYU many years ago, he won't remember. I pressed him on this and said, but no one invited you there. No one invited American, Europeans to the North America. I mean, there's no consent here. And he said in response, the Palestinians started it. That is the conflict that led to the Nakba in 1947-48. He placed Israelis in those cases, pre-state Israel, the Zionist Yishuv, the Zionist settlement there, as the victim of Palestinian aggression. Whereas, of course, Palestinians see it the other way around. It was an insight for me into the mentality of even liberal Israelis that see themselves as chronic victims of intransigent, rejectionist Palestinians and their Arab supporters. That makes a sensible conversation about these issues very difficult if everyone thinks that they're the victims of the other side.
I interviewed Benny Morris and I spoke with a number of people about Benny Morris. Yeah? So to his credit, he and a handful of others, one of which is Avi Schleim, who I also interviewed.
Yeah, he's terrific.
Yeah. personally, if you speak to him, it's just amazing.
Charming man, yeah.
But these people had access to Israel's own state's archive for a limited. There was a window of opportunity in history when these historians, a handful, had access to those files. And of course, once they published those files, the archives were closed again because Israel didn't like what the outcome was. Yeah, but Benny Morris, as opposed to Avi Schleim, right, had a U-turn somewhere in the later years of his life. That's
I think the Second Intifada alienated many liberal Israelis from the possibility of a two-state solution. They reasoned that there's no partner for peace on the Israeli side, on the Palestinian side, and we just have to stick this out. And indeed, it was a mistake not to have, thoroughly cleansed the country of Arabs in 1947 and 48 and 49. So his analysis, I think, is the same. I mean, he's still the same historian, but his evaluation of the ethics of it have changed completely because of his view of his reaction to the terrorism of the late 1990s and into 2001. I mean, there was a lot of terrible Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorism. Buses were being bombed by suicide bombers on a weekly basis, and nightclubs were being bombed and so forth. And this really made it very difficult for the progressive Israeli left to argue that we have to come to an accommodation with Palestinians in order to build a shared future. I mean, I think they're right, but the political space for that kind of case was lessened. The oxygen was taken out of the room for that kind of conversation, and that, as a result, we've had in more or less successive Netanyahu governments for the last 20-odd years or so. I mean, there's been a few liberal, less right-wing governments, but mainly Netanyahu. And now parts of the Israeli population are seeing what the consequences of that are. The consequences were the 7th of October, where the Israeli military forces that were supposed to be watching the border near Gaza in southern Israel were in the West Bank, anticipating uprisings there or helping the settlers conquer the West Bank. So, working hand in glove with the settlers. So the settler project has come to take over Israeli politics, which is not what someone like Benny Morris wants. I mean, I was, chatted with him at a conference a year or two ago in Greece, and we went for a walk through a small town, and we had an affable conversation. I don't think he liked my paper very much, but that wasn't a problem. But it's clear that he was extremely concerned about the constitutional changes which were being forced through at the time, and he was opposed to the settler juggernaut, right? And that his version of a sort of a liberal Zionist Israel was going under. So at the same time, he has this very hard line on the Palestinian movement.
I spoke to him, and we closed Benny Morris hereby, but I spoke to him before September 7th of October. And I asked him, do you see any scenario where Israel could feel compelled to drive out the Palestinians from Gaza and or the West Bank? And he said he doesn't think so, except a cataclysmic event. Now it turns out that the cataclysmic event was much smaller than, in my view, a cataclysmic event is what, a nuclear bomb or something, yeah? So October the 7th, I don't know if it qualifies a cataclysmic event. But, and here I'm coming briefly to Omar Bartov, which I mentioned in my email. He told me that the trajectory to a genocide is first dehumanization, which we clearly see. Then it's ethnic cleansing, which we clearly see in Gaza. Yeah, and if you can't get rid of it, if you can't get rid of them, you kill them. Genocide. And I mean, we see a large scale of killing. So if we follow this through, yeah, and I know you don't have a crystal ball, yeah, but where is this going? I mean, we have seen all these three key markers according to Omar Bartov. Yeah, so where are we going with this?
Well, I mean, I see problems with this sort of linear, rigid, escalation model. Uh, you know, bear in mind our previous thread about what the South African jurists and Francesca Albanese, among many others, of course, Palestinian intellectuals and historians, have identified as a genocidal settler colonial project. Okay, which has been going on for 100 years. There are various moments of acceleration and moments where there's stasis. Okay, so you would need to put what's happening now in the context of a longue durée process, which which has included moments of ethnic cleansing and the taking of land, which is elemental to settler colonialism, as well as killing and dehumanization throughout, for decades. Okay, so what we've got at the moment is a phase of heat, but the process has been going on a lot longer. Okay, that's a view that many people hold, and one approach is the legal approach, which is trying to apply the law to facts. But that's not what historians do. Historians and social scientists are trying to explain, why are these processes happening at all, and how do you explain them? Okay, so I'm not sure, what question you asked Omer Bartov, but I've been following, what he's been saying and writing over the last few months. But like many others, he takes a view that these concepts are settled. You have the law of genocide, you have crimes against humanity, and so forth, and that they reflect something real, rather than there being contingent concepts and laws which were developed throughout the course of the 20th century, were crystallized in laws at the end of the Second World War, and then developed somewhat at various moments, but products of their time. And so you have, as I began with, this artificial distinction between war and genocide. Okay. I mean, you should really consider talking to Martin Shaw, who was the first person to write books and articles about war and genocide. And he and I are in large-scale agreement on these issues, although he thinks the genocide concept is useful, and I think it's to some extent a distraction. I mean, let's ask ourselves what advocacy capacities does the Palestine advocacy movement have left if the ICJ decides that genocide has not taken place? Let's not forget that the ICJ ruled against genocide in the Serbia versus the Bosnia case. I think it's 2007. In the end, they ruled that Serbia was guilty for not having failed to prevent genocide, but not committing genocide. Okay, it's softer. They're very cagey about that. They argue that if you're going to infer intention from a pattern of conduct, the only inference can be that it's genocidal. It can't be any other inferences, So if it's mixed logics where you can infer military and maybe genocidal aspects, then it doesn't satisfy the intent requirement of the Genocide Convention. Now, what then? What then for Palestinians? I mean, Tamils insist genocide took place in 2009 when the Sri Lankan armed forces crushed the Tamil Tigers and killed tens of thousands, if not more, Tamil civilians in the north of Sri Lanka. The Uyghur advocates have been insisting genocide is taking place in China. None of this has been recognized in international law or courts. And who even talks about the Tamil case anymore? It's completely ignored by international society, except, of course, in Tamil communities where it's alive. Likewise with the Biafra secessionist movement in Nigeria in the late 60s, which led to a large international campaign to recognize that genocide was taking place. during which maybe 3 million people starved to death. So the numbers are infinitesimally greater than what we're dealing with in Gaza, and it went over 3 years. Who talks about that case now? Very few people. It's totally ignored in genocide studies. I've tried to introduce that case into genocide studies because it was something that was thrashed out as possibly genocide at the time, with street marches and advocacy, newspaper anguishing, as you see in the Gaza case now. Okay. If you look at these things historically, campaigns to get the international community to recognize particular conflicts as genocide, for example, also East Pakistan in 1971, where Bangladesh was created, right? During which there was also a large-scale genocide claim campaign. These have been largely forgotten. I'm very worried that this will happen in this case. And that's the fatal aspect of playing the genocide recognition game. It's a very high-stakes game. If you win it, like the Armenians have, and like the Tutsis in Rwanda have, there is recognition and so forth. But did genocide recognition help Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh last year? No. The West gets its oil and gas, or energy at least, from Azerbaijan, and historically Armenia has been, in Russia's strategic orbit, and the West did not lift a finger to help Armenians who are ethnically cleansed from Azerbaijan. I'm not necessarily supporting the separatist movement in Nagorno-Karabakh, because that is sovereign Azerbaijani territory. The point is that even with the recognition, large-scale recognition in the West, including by Biden now, that genocide took place in 1915, that did not help the Armenian cause, broadly defined, when Western geopolitical or strategic interests were at stake. But victim groups place enormous hope that getting a genocide recognition will win them all kinds of diplomatic goodies in the decision making of great powers, but in fact it doesn't. So what you need in the end is a state, and that's what the Tutsis got when they defeated the Hutus in 1994. I mean, that genocide only ended because the RPF won the armed conflict. Okay, so, and likewise, the killing of Bangladeshis ended at the end of 1971 because the Indian Army invaded to support the national liberation movement of East Pakistan, who wanted to separate from West Pakistan. So the winners are those that are able to form their own states. Those that fail to get a state at various sort of conjunctures in world history, whether Palestinians, whether Assyrians, or whether Armenians when we're relating to the eastern part of Turkey, which they regard as their historic homeland, they're not the winners in history, and they only have recourse to these symbolic and occasionally legal levers to gain sympathy and in global affairs. But it's as I've been trying to suggest, the genocide law has been pitched at such a high level that to benefit states, who are the winners in global affairs, not to benefit revisionist, if you like, movements who want to join the global community of states, which can only happen by dismembering or sharing an existing state. And that's always going to be resisted by that said state.
It would be very tempting to comment on the Armenians, because that's a solution, a very easy solution for genocide. Just make it illegal to talk about it, yeah, like the Turks did, yeah. first real big genocide. Yeah. Now I know we are on the top of the hour, but there's one little exercise if you still have a couple of minutes. Yeah. Now I asked ChatGPT, what is Dirk Moses best known for? What are his key arguments? Yeah. Now I have to say I'm very critical about ChatGPT because it's absolutely Israel biased. I did a clip actually. I proved with historical knowledge. I used 3 examples. Yeah. One example was that the precursors of the Israeli army, the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, poisoned water wells in Palestine. Yeah, so I used this as a starting point, and I went with ChatGPT through the truth funnel, how we call it, where it was yes, no, first denial, maybe, and then at the end it was yes. Yeah, so I know for a fact, yeah, that ChatGPT is Israel biased and probably biased in other directions. Yeah, nevertheless, I got a couple of examples and I run them by you. So I read you what ChatGPT wrote about a certain topic, and you can comment on it just for a minute or so. I have 10 examples. We don't have to do all of them. You tell me when you have enough. Okay. Now the first one is, Moses argues that genocide should be understood in the context of colonialism, asserting that many genocides, inclusive the Holocaust, have colonial characteristics. This challenges the dominant narrative that sees the Holocaust as a unique, unparalleled event.
I think that's largely true. I started off about 20 years ago editing books and writing essays on the relationship between genocide and colonialism, because I saw that colonial warfare was a kind of genocidal counterinsurgency, because colonial authorities attacked entire quote-unquote tribal groups, the women and the children, in order to snuff out the possibility of future rebellions. And that got me thinking that it's not just colonialism that's related to genocide. The question of security comes in here. It's a paranoid version of security. But we can maybe shelve that to get onto your second one.
Okay. I find it remarkable that we discuss genocide in Israel with someone with the name Moses. Yeah, forgive me, but Moses criticizes the.
Yeah, okay, not a Jewish name in my case.
No.
No.
Moses criticizes the UN Genocide Convention for setting a higher threshold for what constitutes genocide, arguing that this allows states to conduct excessive military operations and inflict civilian casualties without facing genocide charges. I think we discussed this. Huh?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. And then Moses contends that using the Holocaust as an archetype for defining genocide is problematic. He argues that this framing limits the applicability of the genocide concept to other instances of mass violence, thereby diminishing recognition of other atrocities.
Correct.
Yeah. He criticizes the concept of permanent security. That's really something I would like to. Yeah. He criticizes the concept of permanent security pursued by modern states, arguing that it leads to continuous, often illegal state violence against perceived internal and external threats. This concept, he claims, justifies extreme measures, including mass civilian casualties. Permanent security, keyword. We have not really spoken about it.
Sure. So, I mean, that quotation is more or less correct, but I just want to stress that I criticized the fact that states engage in permanent security policies, but I think it's a concept that makes sense. And for me, that's an alternative to genocide. The reason I argue that is that I see the striving of states for, if you like, absolute safety, permanent security, that means security forever, as the driving logic of many attacks, in fact, all kinds of attacks on civilians, some of which are captured by the genocide concept, but many are not. So, what makes permanent security different from, say, regular security, garden variety security that all states engage in? It's trying to future-proof safety. So you're not just confronting an imminent threat. A state is reasoning at moments of crisis, usually, that we want to ensure that never again can a particular group, say an ethnic minority in a border region or a neighbor, present a threat to us, which means we need to eliminate it now, even though that population may be that is innocent. I mean, the women and children and non-combatants are always innocent, right? But if there's a separatist project on the border of a state, as you say in Xinjiang province in China, where there's a large Uyghur population, the Chinese, and there was an uprising in 2011, which is very minor by world standards, but the Chinese authorities call it the Chinese 9/11. The Chinese authorities reasoned not with confining itself to confronting the insurgents, which it's entitled to do, several hundred people, for example. They reasoned that never again will we allow this population, which is a minority within China, but a large population in that border province, which borders other Turkic states, which are seen as ethnic brethren of the Uyghurs, and therefore, this population is seen as potentially disloyal. We want to never again allow the prospect of an uprising, so we need to incarcerate large numbers of the population in these prisons systems and reprogram them to make them less Islamic, more Chinese, and so forth. Right? So this is a wide-scale attack on a population, and the people in those prisons haven't done anything. I mean, they're in there because the Chinese government is worried about what they might do. There's this anticipatory, preemptive dimension to permanent security. An alternative example is the Myanmar case with the Rohingya. In roughly 2017, I think there was a little uprising, and a separatist uprising, in Rakhine State, and the Myanmar military, instead of confining itself to dealing with the actual insurgents, once again, possibly several hundred people, decided that never again will we allow this kind of thing to happen, and they expelled virtually the entire Rohingya population from the country, mainly into Bangladesh, but also into other parts of the region, which has led to this terrible refugee problem and suffering of this population, like 99.99% of which are innocent and weren't involved in these crimes, right? But there's this ascription of collective guilt and potential collective danger for the future. So there's this paranoid element about what could happen, and then acting against an entire population which has been racialized and securitized. And that's the logic that underlies a lot of extreme state conduct. So I think we really need to talk about paranoid security fears of states rather than playing this game of is it genocide, is it not genocide? Because it's very easy for states to say it's not genocide, and then people go, nothing to see here.
But if you bring this to Israel, can Israel not only have permanent, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, coming back to Amalek, permanent security? Does it not, how shall I say, in a theoretical sense, let's say, to make it a bit milder, does it not require you kill the women and the children if you really want 100% permanent security under the umbrella, as outlined by Netanyahu, under the umbrella of Amalek? Because that's exactly what it means.
Many Israeli leaders have been using permanent security language. It's language like this: never again will we allow Gaza to be a staging post for a Hamas attack like the 7th of October. Like never again the 7th of October. That's the language. How you then enact that is something that the Israeli state has not agreed on. This is not a unified government, let alone state. You have the extremist Kahanists in the cabinet who are calling for ethnic cleansing. But even there, they are careful now. They talk about voluntary self-deportation. They should go to Canada or something like that. Even they are being a little more careful than they were. Netanyahu is not wanting to alienate his Western allies, has dialed back his pronunciation since these Amalek-type speeches, and is not talking ethnic cleansing. The military doesn't want a permanent military occupation for various reasons. That's never gone well, and it's expensive and demoralizes the troops. Many of whom get killed. They want Arab states to govern this place, or the UN or something. That's all being worked out. Ideally, I am sure that the consensus in the Israeli political class would be, if they could get away with it, to push Palestinians in Gaza into Egypt, or for other Arab states to take them. But they know that's not going to happen. The Egyptians have just told them, we're not going to take them. Okay, so they're kind of stuck with this, 2 million people in an enclave which they've utterly destroyed and rendered unfit for human habitation. So, how this is handled down the track will be interesting to see, with terrible human suffering. I think I argued in that piece in the Boston Review in mid-November last year that the strategy is to, I predicted or foresaw that the strategy is to create a humanitarian crisis, and for the pressure to build up, the domestic pressure to build up in places like Egypt and other countries to intervene and to say, okay, let's say in the middle of next year or the end of next year, right, when conditions are just utterly unlivable and unbearable, and to take hundreds of thousands, if not more, Gazan Palestinians. I think the realization is set in among the Israeli leadership that it's unlikely that all 2 million will go somewhere else, but they'd like to thin it out as much as possible and to concentrate Palestinians in various enclaves within Gaza, and then for them to be kind of governed by anyone but Hamas. How that happens is another question, right? And for Israel, the Israeli military to dominate the rest and possibly even resettle it. But this is all in flux at the moment. But some kind of permanent security arrangement is certainly being nutted out, and it will be, the way the balance of forces line up within Israel, because there will be elections inevitably, and what Israel's allies are willing to swallow. We don't know what that's going to look like. I mean, ideally, from the settler perspective on the West Bank, that there's an ethnic cleansing of Palestinians into Jordan. But Jordan has made it clear it's not going to take Palestinian refugees for a third time. They took them in 67 and they took them beforehand in 48. And it would destabilize Jordan. And the Americans know this. So they also don't want this, right? So it's really unclear. I mean, in the meantime, if we're talking about this so academically, it's kind of chilling. In the meantime, there's this terrible suffering going on, being endured by Palestinians in both the West Bank and in Gaza. And it's impossible to imagine the conditions of people there, let alone those that haven't been maimed by bombs and missiles. I mean, have people got painkillers? What happens to these children who've had all their limbs blown off or lost eyes? I mean, where are they going to go to school, etc.? I mean, that's not even a conversation in the newspapers at the moment.
Yeah. I think we can skip the rest. You were very, very gracious with your time. I would like to just make one last comparison, and that's the Belgians in Congo, right? When I hear about all those maimed children, yeah, I mean, we can argue if the Belgians had a genocide in Congo or not. That's not my aim, yeah. But what I do know is that systematically, not only killing them was the aim, but also to maim them. Yeah, they hacked off their hands. Yeah,
that's a punishment.
The thought behind it was, this person has to be cared for the rest of his life by his extended family. That means the family has less resources and time and energy, whatever, to fight them. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's the direct intent here in Gaza by Israel, but it will have the effect.
No doubt. No doubt. Once again, there's this legal categorization, and then there's the reality on the ground. And the suffering is incalculable, but it's been inflicted in a quite calculated way. I mean, there's a complete disregard for Palestinian life in Israeli society at the moment. As Israeli colleagues and friends tell me, I can't read Israeli social media and the press in Hebrew, but I read a lot of it in English, and I'm in constant contact with Israeli academic colleagues who are sending me clips and then translating them for me. And they're in despair because they feel very isolated in this context and are shocked by the utterances from friends and relatives who are otherwise loving people but are saying extraordinary things at this. For whom the 7th of October was a cataclysmic moment. You mentioned this issue of cataclysms before. For Israeli society and many Jews outside Israel, the 7th of October was a cataclysmic event. And, I've seen articles where people are saying, particularly religiously motivated people, that, time started again. We're back in a kind of a Holocaust time, and that all this progress we thought we made since the Holocaust, having our own state and, where we're safe, and then also living in societies like Australia and America and Germany where we're safe, all that's gone. We're not safe anymore anywhere. So there's this sense of panic and existential insecurity, which then leads to this coarsening of political debate and a complete disregard for the civilians in Gaza. It's a very tragic moment.
On that not too positive note, Dirk Moses, thank you very much for your time. It's really appreciated.
Okay, good to talk with you.